I'm Nancy Beck from the board of the Princeton Adult School, and I'd like to welcome you to the third lecture in our Marco Polo series. I hope none of you showed up last week and had to take a test. The reading list on the Mongol that Professor Kotkin promised us is available. It's up there. You can get it as you came in or went out. It also was sent to anybody who gave us an email address. We'll bring them again next week if anybody missed them. Before I forget, I want to remind you again that the next two lectures are the reverse of what they were in the catalog. They are correct on your ticket, and they're correct on our website. Next week will be Professor Zia Mian speaking on Pakistan, and the following week is Professor Michael Berry. Now, to move from the Mongols to the present. We could not have known in February, when we were putting this series together, that the first week in November would be just the time to schedule a lecture on Afghanistan. But here we are, with a subject that couldn't be more timely, and with a speaker who couldn't be more knowledgeable. Robert Finn, who received his PhD from Princeton, currently has a dual appointment at the university in the Department of Near Eastern Studies and in the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. His career has been both in the diplomatic service with the State Department and in the academic world. He was a Fulbright scholar at Istanbul University, and along with his teaching at Princeton, he is a research associate at the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination. In addition to diplomatic postings in Turkey, Pakistan, and Croatia, he opened the U.S. Embassy in Azerbaijan in 1992, was the ambassador to Tajikistan from 1998 to 2001, and presumably in preparation for tonight's lecture, he was the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan in 2002 and 2003. Ambassador Finn has received numerous awards from the U.S. government, including 2 Presidential Meritorious Service Awards and an award for heroism. As if that weren't enough, his poems, articles, and translations, as well as his book, The Early Turkish Novel, have been published both in the U.S. and abroad. I can't think of anyone better able to help us try to understand Afghanistan, tribes, and tribulations. Ambassador Finn.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you for coming out tonight. Our subject is tribes and tribulations, and I'm going to speak about the tribes while I suffer the tribulations from the lunch I had at Prospect House today, which is making lots of movement inside me. My talk is not going to be an historical one, although there'll be historical elements in it, but it's very focused on what is going on right now, which we're all very concerned about for very obvious reasons. And I hope that afterwards you'll be happy to ask me any questions that you want. I'll probably talk for about 45 minutes or so. President Obama said when he took office that Afghanistan would be his let me do this, I think that's better, would be his #1 foreign affairs priority. And it looks like it may become his #1 foreign affairs nemesis. Can you all hear me? Louder. Louder. Okay. How do we do louder? This room has terrible acoustics.
Let's try that.
Okay, is that any better? No. How does that sound? A little better?
It's on.
Okay, well, all right. Finally paid the electric bill. President Obama said when he took office that Afghanistan would be his #1 foreign affairs priority. It looks like it may become his #1 foreign affairs nemesis. General McChrystal's counterinsurgency plan calls for thousands of new troops and an increased prolonged engagement to enable Afghan security forces to achieve proficiency. It also calls for more development funding, increased civilian presence, and improving an Afghan government that is weak on administration but strong on corruption. President Obama has said that he is not going to make new commitments until he is sure that the plan is the correct one. He said that he will not commit U.S. forces to stay in Afghanistan ad infinitum. In this, he is correct. At the same time, McChrystal and others point out that we can win the war in Afghanistan, but in order to do this, we need firm, long-lasting commitment. The bewildering array of clocks that deal with Afghanistan all tick at different speeds, but none of them seems to tick slowly enough for victory. Our American political system is geared towards elections, meaning that the administration will face a litmus test on Afghanistan at the time of the midterm elections next year, 1 year from today. Mature observers know that a much longer time frame is needed before lasting positive results will appear in Afghanistan. However, more than half of the American people no longer wishes to be there. The same is true in many of the other countries which have troops in Afghanistan. The German bombing in Kunduz put Chancellor Merkel in difficulty as Germany moved towards elections. And the deaths of 5 Italian soldiers in Kabul led to an immediate, strong negative reaction in Italy. The British and Canadian publics are growing increasingly weary of a war in which they, along with the U.S., bear the brunt of the casualties. Pakistan remains the more serious problem, one which a failure in Afghanistan could ignite in ways that none of us wishes to see. The Pakistani military finally took action against Taliban groups in Swat and Waziristan, with press reports alleging in turn that they have committed human rights violations. The attacks in Pakistan, the latest only yesterday, and in particular the attack on the military headquarters in Rawalpindi, show the extent of Taliban reach. Pakistan is a tinderbox of social discontent, regional resentment, and fundamentalist activity. It is also bankrupt, has a weak government, and possesses a nuclear arsenal that it already nearly used against India. But now I'd like to step back a little and present a kind of holistic picture that traces some of what went wrong in Afghanistan and places Afghanistan in a regional and historical context that can help us understand why things happen as they do. What is new to us may be very old news to people who live there. A little over 7 years ago, I arrived in Kabul to be the United States ambassador. When I stepped off the plane at one end of the runway, security personnel quickly took me by both arms to keep me from stepping off the tarmac onto an active minefield. We carefully picked our way through the mines, unexploded ordnance and piles of destroyed aircraft and armaments, and proceeded along the road that led from the airport to the American embassy. The scene was not unfamiliar to me from previous assignments in war zones and growing up in the Bronx. Burned out buildings, destroyed infrastructure, the litter and left-behinds of military campaigns. What caught my eye, however, were the carefully painted new signs along the road. They advertised tire repair, welding, machine shops, and other unglamorous basic services that were going on in the primitive shops behind them. I thought to myself, well, these people have spent what little money they have on these signs. They have nothing, but they have hope and they have commitment. I knew that the mission in Afghanistan would be difficult, but not how difficult it would be. I knew that it would be costly, but not that Afghanistan would be shortchanged all along the way. and I knew that it would probably take longer than we were willing to accept. For the first few years, it appeared that the promise would be fulfilled. The Taliban withdrew, and it seemed in 2003 that the actual fighting would lessen or disappear within a year or so. The optimism this produced encouraged a light-foot approach to Afghanistan that took as its starting point a belief that only a little needed to be done, and the problems of Afghanistan would take care of themselves. Very wrong. And Washington did little to get rid of the warlords it had allied with out of expediency to get rid of the Taliban. Instead, they were cultivated and remained in positions of power. Wrong again. Washington diverted its attention and its resources to Iraq, and Afghanistan has paid the price in a number of areas, as neither sufficient funding nor personnel were made available. Now things are much worse and will cost much more to repair. One of these neglected areas is the lack of civil and structural development. From the beginning, Afghans have complained about the lack of visible development and failure of government, and the response has mainly been to fund the military. In Afghanistan, the need for both civil and military input grew geometrically, with funding always arriving later and less than needed. Since the effort in Afghanistan began, the gap between development need and funding has been fairly consistent. The international community pledged half of what the Afghans needed and then delivered only half of that. In addition, most of that funding actually was spent outside of Afghanistan, particularly U.S. funding. U.S. law requires U.S. firms to receive much of the contracting. So a tiered system has developed where the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, contracts to American firms, who then contract to other firms, perhaps Turkish or Pakistani, who then in turn contract to Afghan firms. Each firm takes its cut of the contract, say 15%. The result is that actual funds dispersed in Afghanistan to Afghans are substantially less than the amount of money dispersed for Afghanistan. Afghans resent both the presence of highly paid foreigners and their inability to be masters in their own house. The world community arrived in numbers, as soldiers and government officials, members of non-governmental organizations, and traders from neighboring countries. All arrived with visions, missions, and physical demands exceeding resources and personnel. To date, a mixture of progress and failure has occurred. Partly, geography has determined destiny. The physical difficulties of Afghanistan, a large mountainous country whose few roads were destroyed, make basic communication and transportation difficult and expensive propositions. In the former Yugoslavia, good roads and substantial housing, a developed infrastructure and an educated population made refurbishing after the war a relatively simple proposition. None of those existed in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, what geography didn't limit, sparse funding did. Bosnia-Herzegovina received over $279 per capita in the first 2 years after peace was made, and East Timor $256. In Afghanistan, the figure was $67. According to the Congressional Research Service, spending for Afghanistan through fiscal year 2009 comes to about $200 billion, of which 94% has gone for military spending and only 6% for development and embassy programs. The lack of development is one of the major complaints of Afghans. There is a failure to train competent government officials in a land destroyed by war and where a whole generation of government employees have been educated in a Soviet command economy. The Afghan government fell back on traditional tribal leaders and untrained, often illiterate personnel to manage the countryside. Not surprisingly, they proved to be both dysfunctional and corrupt. The failure to train a functioning bureaucracy and pay them a living wage is an important fact in the failure of Afghan governance. Attempts to set up a civil service academy have not succeeded, although a military academy has been in operation since 2005. Afghanistan should set one up immediately, perhaps with cooperation from Pakistan and India, both of which have such institutions. In addition, model provinces could be set up with special implementation and infrastructure to demonstrate what good government is like. The province of Bamiyan would be a good place to start. With Afghanistan's only lady governor and a population that largely consists of minority Hazaras, Bamiyan is relatively secure and relatively unassisted. When I visited there in 2003, I learned that the Taliban had not only destroyed the Buddhas, but killed thousands and destroyed all the buildings they could manage in this ancient seat of culture and learning. I also learned that Bamiyan had never had electricity, and until last year, it did not have a paved road either. Millions of Afghans have returned home from Iran and Pakistan, the largest refugee return in history. Some 4 million have come back, but millions more remain abroad in poverty and now unwelcome. Iran has been pushing refugees back into Afghanistan in the last year, and Pakistan has begun to do the same. In addition, there are now large numbers of Pakistani refugees from Pakistan who have fled the fighting and Taliban takeover there. The country they have come to is desperate. Afghanistan was one of the poorest countries on earth before 30 years of war and remains at or near the bottom on almost every human indicator. Lakhdar, special representative of the UN for Afghanistan, said that it would be a great success if the international community could, in 10 years of work, move Afghanistan up to being only the 10th poorest country in the world. Still, in many measures, Afghanistan has made remarkable advances. Income has trebled to about $365 per year, compared to $527 in neighboring Tajikistan and $900 in Pakistan. 80% of Afghans now have access to some kind of health care, although life expectancy is still only 43 years, and 16% of Afghan women will die during childbirth. Infant deaths have declined 18%, but 1 of 4 children still dies before the age of 5. In 2001, there were only a few thousand, mostly non-working phones in Afghanistan. Now 55% of the population has access, and 38% report access to a television. There are now over 5 million children in school, 60% of school-age children. In primary school, over 35% of those students are girls. But in, in secondary schools, that falls to 5%. More than half of those schools do not have buildings, and often they do not have books or even teachers. I myself saw a 12-year-old who was running a school in Kabul, and doing pretty well, actually. The bond program of elections and a constitution was implemented. A national army that shows promising signs needs much more work, and a number of governmental institutions are in place. When one compares Afghanistan in 2009 to Afghanistan in 2001, there is really much that has been done. But there is even more that has not been done. Gains in women's rights and a free press remain fragile and even seem sometimes to be moving backwards. The presidential election is a prime example of what is wrong. Months ago, there were reports about false registration and preparations for voter fraud. Press reported flagrant cheating in the voting process, and not just on the part of the Karzai supporters. Calls for a national government that would have former Foreign Minister Dr. Abdullah work together with Karzai have been so far rejected. In the end, Karzai will remain in office, and the world community will have to deal with him. Needless to say, his legitimacy and that of his government will be tarnished even more. The Taliban will use that in their propaganda, but they have already called the Kabul government illegitimate. Today's news reports that Karzai will launch a campaign to clamp down on corruption in response to strong external pressure. I will wait to see if substantial change takes place. The security situation in Afghanistan is visibly deteriorating. The Taliban now are present or in control of some 1/3 of the districts nationwide and have shown that they can strike virtually anywhere. High-profile attacks cause strong reaction, especially when foreigners are involved. General McChrystal's counterinsurgency plans will not prevent such attacks in the short run, but he believes that he can win in the long run. A short-term commitment will not be enough, and the Taliban and al-Qaeda count on the growing weariness of their enemy and the Afghan people. Pakistan is now essentially threatened by the same militant activity as Afghanistan. The Pakistani military finally took action when agreements and negotiations failed. According to Ahmed Rashid, the Pakistani military is still fixed on the Indian border and a possible attack there. In addition, Baluchistan, Pakistan's southern border region with Afghanistan, has been in a state of more or less open rebellion throughout Pakistan's history. A failure in Afghanistan will aggravate the serious problems in Pakistan, and that is the reason we cannot just walk away from Afghanistan. The result could be a much wider disaster. We ignore that possibility at our own peril. We must be cautious but realistic. There are factors in our favor. The Taliban are not one group, and neither is al-Qaeda. Latest reports indicate diminishing numbers of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and even more importantly, diminishing approval of its tactics, including suicide bombing, in a number of Muslim countries. Not all the fighters are ideologues. Many of them are fighting for economic reasons, or because their tribal leaders make them. There is room for negotiation and for changing mindsets. The efforts to stop controversial bombings that kill civilians are part of this. So are the efforts to increase security in specific areas. Polling figures show that Afghans are growing less pleased with the direction in which their country is going, less pleased with the presence of foreign troops in their country, and less pleased with the United States' efforts to help Afghanistan. But they also show that the people of Afghanistan do not want the Taliban and al-Qaeda, that in spite of their increasingly vocal complaints about bombing, corruption, and poor governance, 82% say they still prefer the current Afghan government, and only 8% say they even approve of the Taliban. Many people in Afghanistan on all levels of society told me the same thing. They said, we want you to be here. We want you to succeed. But many others have come here and did not succeed, and we will always be here. If you do not succeed, and we want you to, we will have to find a way to live anyway. The Taliban are counting on being able to outlast us, to make sure that the people eventually look to them for stability and security. In 1986, Soviet Marshal Akrameyev told the Soviet Duma, "We have lost the battle for the Afghan people." That is not the case for us in Afghanistan for many reasons, but it could change. Afghans look to their own government and the international community for stability, for assurances, political, economic, that they have a future they can move towards, and not a recurrence of the nightmare from which they have escaped. They see the problems and inadequacies around them, the corruption and waste, and often do not understand how nations so powerful and rich could have been so incapable of resolving these issues. The problems of Afghanistan are at least as perplexing to us as well. The criticisms of Afghanistan and the Karzai government are now familiar. Lack of governance is one of the main complaints of the Afghan people. Bad governance is another. The Kabul government is often not present in the provinces, and when it is, it is most likely to be in the form of corrupt police officials or local power lords who have received a mandate to govern from Kabul, but who are in fact simply continuing tribal and group power structures that have previously existed. The Afghan people have long been used to rule themselves through tribal councils and by traditional methods. Trade-offs based on traditional structures, however, may reinforce many of the practices which allowed the Taliban to come into power in the first place, and others, such as subjugation of women, which are objectionable to many. In the end, like it or not, they may become part of the solution. After 7 years of war in Afghanistan, President Obama brought a clear focus and statement of intent to the issues of the region last spring. The White House initiative is focused on defeat of the Taliban and al-Qaeda and removal of the military threat to Afghanistan which they represent. Additional U.S. forces would go to Afghanistan, but repeated calls on NATO allies to increase their own commitments have mostly gone unanswered, and support for the war is diminishing everywhere. General McChrystal's new report states that defeat is likely if troop levels do not increase. Not everyone in the White House is so sure. The brunt of the fighting in Afghanistan has been done by the US, UK, Canada, Netherlands, and France. Other nations have restricted their soldiers with so-called caveats that limit them to defensive, assistance, or auxiliary functions. European leaders have not made it clear to their voters that the action is a war and not a social assistance program. This accounted for part of the outcry in Germany when German planes bombed fuel trucks that were in Taliban hands, killing a number of civilians in the process. Along with the emphasis of the new plan on a concerted military effort to deal with the Taliban in Afghanistan is a recognition that Pakistan and Afghanistan now constitute a shared region of conflict, as Ambassador Holbrooke has also pointed out. The war is spreading, not ending, and time is running out on the clocks that tick for Afghanistan. Pakistanis, however, do not like to be linked with Afghanistan. Pakistani public opinion still persists in regarding the fundamentalist activities in their country as a United States problem. Secretary Clinton got the full brunt of that feeling on her visit to Pakistan last week. Last spring saw the social disruption caused by the fundamentalist activities in Swat, where Islamic activists targeted the ruling landlord class and either killed or drove them out of the area. This aspect of their activities, a social revolution couched in Islamic terms, in a country where hereditary land holdings and an impoverished peasant class with a keen sense of injustice and deprivation are the norm, could easily spread to other areas of Pakistan as well. When I served in Pakistan 20 years ago, Taliban groups were forming, and politicians, many of them still active today, were trying to use those groups to thwart their political rivals. It was clear to me then that they would themselves become the victims of these groups, which saw all of them, landlords and industrialists, as bad Muslims and exploiters. Now it is happening. Pakistan is in a serious state of crisis, with a military which has until recently been ineffectual in fighting the militants, and at the same time, in its ISI branch, accused of colluding with them against the United States. The new American plan includes large sums of money for Pakistan. Who will administer those funds and how they will be controlled is of critical importance. For 50 years, Pakistani officials have told us everything would be okay, and it has not been okay. Corruption and misappropriation are endemic in Pakistan. Much of U.S. military funding for Pakistan went for weapons to be used for defense against India, and not for their designated anti-terrorism purposes. I would like to believe that funds will be properly controlled and used this time. Moving back to Afghanistan, President Obama has also called for a significant increase in the civilian presence in Afghanistan and in assistance for development. The personnel to staff these positions are now in the process of being identified. The Office the State Department set up several years ago to deal with crisis situations was not funded by Congress until this fiscal year, so the process is not where it should be. The Secretary of Defense asked Congress in March of this year to fund the Department of State to relieve pressure on his personnel. He should not have had to do that. Considering the situation on the ground, an immediately accelerated effort is necessary. A number of commentators have noted that the White House plan of last spring and General McChrystal's new iteration of it seem more designed to produce a military outcome. But that will be insufficient to eliminate the base conditions that gave rise to the Taliban. The development and Afghan governance parts of the White House plan need quick articulation and implementation. The government knows how many troops will go, where they will go, and what they will do. It has not laid out a similarly clear plan for the civilian side. This is insufficient and harmful. To think of the problem of Afghanistan as only a military one misses the main reason why we were there, to prevent Afghanistan from once again becoming a platform for international terrorism. An Afghanistan that cannot feed, protect, or finance itself is ripe for exploitation. In addition, the McChrystal plan calls for most of the civilian officials to be placed within the military in provincial reconstruction teams for valid security reasons. To most Afghans, however, since they come from military bases, they will still seem to be military officials. In any event, most of these individuals, more often than not, cannot leave their military retreats to do their work because of security issues. The bottom line is that there is far more attention and planning being paid to military operations and security concerns than preparing the context, economic, governmental, and social, that is critical to the continued viability of Afghanistan. Having said that, the training of an Afghan national army and police is obviously an imperative. The army is performing well in coordination with outside forces. The police are doing less well. Time is needed to increase their size and proficiency. Large numbers of trainers are needed. It is a long-term project. In both cases, basic literacy is a problem which must be dealt with if Afghanistan is to have a modern security structure. It is unthinkable that many of the Afghan military are illiterate. How can they be expected to read manuals, keep instructions, or even basic accounts? Along with a modern military, Afghanistan needs an economic structure that can support it. The current planning is for a combined army and police forces of 220,000 individuals. Afghanistan's economy simply cannot support that. So other nations need to help Afghanistan do one or more of three things: build a viable economy that can support itself, including the military, solve the security problem, or expect that someone else will pay for its military indefinitely. Aside from the military, Afghanistan needs to pay for itself and run itself if the international community is ever going to be able to withdraw completely. Winning the war is only one part of the issue. Afghanistan has the potential to become a self-sustaining country with oil and gas deposits, minerals, transport, gemstones, and agriculture. China is investing $3.5 billion in the huge Aina copper field and will build Afghanistan's first railroad to connect China through Tajikistan and Afghanistan to Pakistan to exploit the holdings for profit and protected by coalition, not Chinese troops. Pipelines to bring oil and gas from Afghanistan's western neighbors, including Iran, to Pakistan and India could also generate income for Afghanistan. A road network that connected Central Asia with the sea through Afghanistan could bring substantial economic benefits for all concerned. A truck could go from Tashkent in Uzbekistan to Karachi in 18 hours through a stable Afghanistan, whereas now that truck must travel a week across Central Asia and Russia to arrive at a port. The road connection that India and Iran are building from the Iranian port of Charbahar to the Afghan ring road is another avenue for transport and may even be used to bring in military material for the war in Afghanistan. It should be noted that the new agreements made with Central Asian countries and Russia to transport war material to Afghanistan will come with a high price tag and will not replace the now fragmented access through Pakistan. In terms of enhancing our security relationships with Central Asia, they serve a useful purpose. As Afghanistan used to feed itself, it can do so again. The Soviets destroyed the orchards, vineyards, and centuries-old underground canal system that were the backbone of Afghan agriculture. The rise in opium production is one response. In almost every part of Afghanistan, farmers have said that they would prefer to grow a different crop. In order to do this, they need price supports, alternative crops, and a multi-year program to make the transition. As it is, more provinces each year are free of opium production, with the overwhelming majority of producers now in Helmand province, where the Taliban are most prevalent. The production assists the Taliban war effort and places producers in a questionable relationship with the government. The money is made mainly not by the farmers, but by the traffickers and transporters. They should be targeted first. One of the most visible failures of the Kabul government is its inability and/or unwillingness to move on this with regard to government officials and allegedly relatives of President Karzai. For the world, the problem of Afghanistan stretches beyond the borders of that country. The proximate reason for the intervention by the United Nations in Afghanistan was the hijacking of Afghanistan by an international terrorist organization. That threat still persists. For us, it is a global concern, and the action is thankfully far away. For the people of the region, it is a direct threat to their own lives. When we look at the maps, we see the dotted lines that denote nation states and think that somehow problems are contained within them. For people who live there, and not just the Pashtuns on either side of the Durand line, those dotted lines barely exist. Their history reinforces this. Until quite recently, educated people in the area stretching from Iran to India were expected to know Persian, which was the language of literature and culture, and for hundreds of years the language of government in India. Babur, the famous founder of the Mughal dynasty, came from the Fergana Valley in what is now Uzbekistan. Driven out, he conquered Kabul and then Delhi. But it was to Kabul that he returned when he died. As ambassador, I was able to get some funds to help restore his tomb and garden, which overlooks the valley of Kabul, which he thought was the most beautiful view on earth. The Dari of Afghanistan is an older and to Iranians perfectly comprehensible version of Persian, as is the Tajik of Tajikistan. The great cities of Central Asian culture, Bukhara and Samarkand, now in Uzbekistan, were and are Persian-speaking. Herat in western Afghanistan is considered one of the main wellsprings of Persian civilization. And Rumi, the Sufi poet who is so popular in this country, was a war refugee from Balkh in Afghanistan who fled westward until he came to Konya in Turkey. His Persian Mesnevi is one of the great books of mankind. People in this region share their culture and their concerns. We should share them as well. Modern demarcations do not tell us the whole story. There are more Tajiks in Afghanistan than in Tajikistan. Millions of Uzbeks and Turkmen as well, and an ill-treated minority, the Hazara, whose Oriental looks belie their Mongol origin, but whose Shia faith attaches them to Iran. As the Russians pushed outward into Central Asia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, masses of people fled before them. Many of the residents of northern Afghanistan and western China have close ties across the former Soviet border. When the Taliban were close to the complete takeover of Afghanistan in 2001, I was ambassador in Tajikistan to the north, where we were preparing refugee camps for the expected exodus of Northern Alliance soldiers, mostly Tajiks. Iranians, Russians, and Indians were sending them assistance. During the Cold War, India was a friend of the Soviet Union, and it is no accident that India has since opened its first military base abroad in Tajikistan. In historical terms, Babur went south to conquer India, but Hindu missionaries, scholars, and traders went north as well. Even today, there are traces of Indian culture well into Tajikistan. And the largest Buddha left in Central Asia after the destruction of the images in Bamiyan is in the museum in Dushanbe, the capital of Tajikistan. And again, U.S. government money from the Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation helped pay to bring it back together. 10 years ago, Tajikistan realized it was turning into another Afghanistan and ended its civil war with a compromise that gave governmental representation to the Islamic Party and brought a measure of stability to that troubled land. Afterwards, Uzbek fundamentalists who had been fighting in Tajikistan were made to leave. Many of them went south to join up with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Later, they fled to Pakistan, where they are active with Al-Qaeda. According to today's New York Times, Pakistani military forces have taken the two villages that were their headquarters. I've also seen reports that some of these fighters have recently been filtering back into Central Asia, overpowering control points on the Tajik-Kyrgyz border. The fact is, the connections of the area go back much longer and more deeply than we know. Important to bear in mind as we try to deal with our problems in this region. One effect is that the specter of Afghanistan has overshadowed all efforts for democratic reform in the countries to the north, which see Afghanistan as an example of what can happen if governments do not severely control their populations. They may not be right, but there is no denying their valid fear of politicized fundamentalists. Both Russia and China have taken positions supportive of the inter-Asian governments, both individually and through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Since its inception in 2001, this organization, which includes over 1/4 of mankind, has taken an increasingly higher profile in the area, including holding joint military maneuvers. Washington needs to develop a multidimensional policy for Central Asia that would include military and economic cooperation, security dialogue, and an open explication of what the U.S. intends to do. Lack of clarity feeds the suspicions of governments in the area and reinforces Russian claims that the U.S. intends to bring regime change. In addition, Central Asia will be an increasingly important strategic area in the new century. Vast, underpopulated, with enormous energy resources and other potential, it could easily be called the New World. The U.S. needs to know what it wants in the area. As it is, the war in Afghanistan has brought apprehension of both Islamic fundamentalism and the U.S. presence in the region to the Central Asian states and to China and Russia, both of whom regard Central Asia as their sphere of influence. All of these countries, frontline states for Islamic fundamentalism, should be included more in solving the problems of Afghanistan. Mutual recriminations from Pakistan and India that the other is using Afghanistan to its own advantage are correct on both sides. Pakistan has demonstrated that it does not want a strong government in Afghanistan. Afghanistan has refused to accept the Durand Line as the border with Pakistan. And India has used its relations with Afghanistan to encourage Pakistani nervousness. Even though Pakistan and India stand to benefit from the economic advantages that trade and energy pipelines could bring them, they have persisted in using Afghanistan as a playing field in their rivalries. India has clearly won in Afghan popular opinion. Even though there are several million Afghan refugees living in Pakistan, only 8% of Afghans view Pakistan favorably. The attack on Mumbai in India last year is another example of the regional aspect of the problem. The Indian foreign minister acknowledged that the attack was designed to ruin Indo-Pakistani relations and divert Pakistani military forces from the west, Afghanistan, to the east, India, and said that he was not sure his government would be able to remain quiet if another such attack took place. No stability in Afghanistan can last while India and Pakistan included in the equation of their own tensions. One must add to this increasingly large equation the question of Kashmir. Bin Laden came to Afghanistan to set up camps to liberate Kashmir, which has been the main problem in relations between India and Pakistan. And no final peace in the region can fail to take it into account. The Taliban took over in Swat, then started to move into other areas as well. If they had succeeded, they would have had control of the whole crescent of territories from the tribal areas of Pakistan through to the border of Gilgit next to Kashmir, basically connecting Afghanistan with India. They came to only 100 miles from Islamabad. Their message was one of societal reform and distributive justice as much as religious conservatism. It is a very serious situation, and accommodation by Islamabad proved to be a failure. Now the military is fighting in parts of the tribal areas as well. The long-term stability of Pakistan is a vital concern for all. Iran has also played a role in Afghanistan, both helpful and harmful. In the Bonn process, it played an important role in bringing the parties together and provided help to the military effort as well. It has lost over 3,000 police and soldiers fighting drug trafficking from Afghanistan. After this initial cooperation in 2001, Iran bitterly resented being added to the axis of evil. While Iran can and should, for its own benefit, be helpful in Afghanistan, it has also made it clear that it could cause trouble for Allied and specifically U.S. troops whenever it wished. Strained relations with Iran will also impact on the war in Afghanistan. People of the region know that a Persian sword is one which can cut both ways. Afghanistan's internal challenges will not go away because Western donors are tired. Externally, it is threatened by interfering neighbors and a global threat. Internally, it is threatened by corruption and lack of governance. For Afghanistan to cease to be a platform for international terrorists, the military threat to it must be removed, and steps made to ensure that Afghanistan does not fall into the same situation that led to the Taliban takeover. It will be expensive and long-term, and we must prepare for that. The challenge is now greater than it was in 2001. It is our priority foreign affairs issue, as it should be. Implementation is still largely on paper, however, particularly for the non-military parts of the program. The problem is very difficult and getting worse. Many Americans understandably want to find a way out of a situation in which they didn't want to be in the first place. When I left Tajikistan in July 2001, I told Washington that we did not have a choice about whether to fight Islamic fundamentalism, but only a possible choice about where we would fight it. That is just as true today. We cannot walk away, and it will be very difficult if we stay. Thank you. Instead of saying thank you, I should say I'm sorry. Questions? No questions? Yes, sir. Well, in a number of ways it did. Iraq and Afghanistan what did the intervention in Iraq have any effect on the thought processes of the Afghan people? The two countries are very different. Afghanistan is one of the most undeveloped countries in the world. Iraq was relatively a very highly developed, urbanized country with a high level of education. So different social situations. The effect it had, there were a couple of effects it had. One is that we diverted our energy, our psychological energy, as well as a lot of our resources to Iraq. And so things weren't there in Afghanistan that needed to be there. And by the way, sadly, the things that I'm saying here are things that I was saying from the get-go. I have not changed my tune. So we never had enough people there to do the job right. So that was part of that. And then the really bad part is that the Al-Qaeda and okay, better? Yeah, okay. Is that Al-Qaeda and Taliban started to emulate the techniques that were successful in Iraq, such as suicide bombing, and bring that to Afghanistan, a place which had never had things like that before. So those were effects that I see in Afghanistan. In the region as a whole, the mantra that Russia certainly was giving, and also that some of the leaders in the Central Asian countries are giving to the people, was that, see, if you become the friend of America, you wind up like being like Iraq or Afghanistan. If you become the friend of Russia, we'll give you money to build dams and things, and everything will be fine. We'll increase trading. So that certainly was a message that got through loudly and clearly to people in Central Asia, who are terrified, rightly terrified of Afghanistan, which is right next door. I mean, the reason that Karimov in Uzbekistan is so terrible is specifically because of the example of Afghanistan. And the reason that Tajikistan is the way it is because they said, we're turning into Tajikistan. So it's a very salient lesson for them. But Iraq, I would just say in those particular things. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah, well, being a diplomat, I have several answers. Yeah, the question is, what is the question? The question is, we dealt with those warlords. Was it a mistake to deal with the warlords in the beginning? And don't we have to deal with warlords on a local basis as we're trying to run the country? The term, everything's going awry here. The term warlord is of course, a charged term. Is this going to be better? Okay. The term warlord, has a pejorative sense to it. So if you like them, they're tribal leaders. If you don't like them, they're warlords. And they change, minute by minute. Everyone in Afghanistan is constantly reevaluating their relationships. So to get to the second part of your question, first, yeah, you have to deal with whoever is on the ground who has the power. And the suggestion I was making here is that you train a government bureaucracy which can then go out and be in charge and know what it is it's supposed to be doing in the first place to supplant that, okay? And then what you also do, and this is where my cynical diplomatic side comes in, is that you push these people into other activities, okay? So I'm from the Bronx. I know you had to have a tough guy around to help you, because I wasn't a tough guy growing up. So you need those people, and we used whom we needed to use in the working.
Try it again.
Okay. Is this better? How's this? Okay, can you hear me now? All right. So in the beginning, we found whom we needed to find who was there who could help us to get rid of Taliban, and I had absolutely no problem with that. And soon afterwards, I said, okay, let's start to get rid of these people. Let's push them out. Because you don't need them forever. You don't have to have them as ministers in the government. You should gradually marginalize those people and replace them with other people. That process didn't take place. I also tried to encourage people like Dostum and Atta, who are up in the northwest, to develop the oil and gas reserves that were on their property, because they were literally fighting over cows and killing people. And I tried to turn them into industrialists, because if they get really rich, they don't want to die. And then they stop killing people so much. And that's a process. I mean, that's how Europe turned into what it was today. They weren't so much better 500 years ago. But that process didn't take place. It should have taken place. We should have done that. Maybe we should have been, more cynical. But yeah, you have to deal with who's there, who the power is. And I can assure you, in Afghanistan, everybody is constantly talking to everyone else all the time. What now looks like a very bad situation could change very quickly. And Afghans always have their eye out for the winner. That's one of the reasons why Dr. Abdullah didn't run in the second round, because he knows what Afghans are like, and everybody knew he was going to lose. He knew that nobody would vote for him. So he decided to trim his losses. Yes, yes, ma'am.
Oh, it sounds as if there's so many problems. How would you prioritize them in the current terms, and what would you do about the military situation?
Well, I kind of laid out the suggestions. You can't just do one thing. We like to make a list and do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can't do that. You have to do all of them at the same time. And then you get into the problem, of course, of funding for that. And now we all know we have a lot less money than we did a few years ago. What I'm saying here is that along with the military thing, and I'm not opposed to military action, we have to have military action. I think if we had had more soldiers there earlier, we wouldn't be in this situation. But we have to do the other sides so that we can create a texture from which we can withdraw. Because if we just look at it as a military problem and then we leave, then it's all going to fall apart. We have to create something that we can get away from. So we have to do these things. And you can start it in a little way. That's why I suggested this model province thing, which, God help us, I took from the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. They did that. Since the government will not cooperate in setting up a proper governmental structure, and it's not as though we didn't talk to them about this, then do it somewhere else and set that up in one place, and then maybe another place, 2 places, and then say, okay, here it is. See, it can work. This is your country. It can work. Bye. Which they don't want to hear, by the way. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What is the relationship between China and Afghanistan? What are the prospects of getting the Chinese government to help us?
Well, they are helping. China is in a state. They have, as they think by themselves, and as you know, China is the center of the world. So they're going to do things their way. And what that means is they're probably not going to help us in a military way, because that's not what they're doing right now. What they're doing is building up their economic relationships and their economic advantage all around the world. China is trying to line up the resources for the next century. And that's one reason why they're investing in this largest copper mine in the world, because that's useful to them. But at the same time, of course, it's going to help the economy of Afghanistan, and they're doing other economic things in Afghanistan. So that's where they can help us. But I think we should push them more, because they have the self-advertised problem of Islamic fundamentalism in Xinjiang, and you can make a big case for it not being that, but in fact ethnic nationalism. But anyhow, they've declared it that. And they have, in fact, found some people from Xinjiang fighting with al-Qaeda. So I think maybe they could be pushed harder on this. But at the moment, they're interested in establishing good economic relations and economic interpenetration with all of their neighbors in Central Asia. There are very, very interesting things going on there. And Afghanistan is part of that. So they're doing some things, but I think we can get them to do more. Yeah, and yes, sir. It did. That's a good point. But those were not Afghans. He said, okay, we only have part A.
The question is, if you're looking at it from al-Qaeda's standpoint, and now they caused all the trouble they have in Pakistan, and you read Ahmad Rashid's unique assessment of the fact that the ISI never stopped fighting the Taliban and al-Qaeda. From al-Qaeda's point of view, aren't they really winning this thing?
Oh, yeah, of course they think they're winning. You didn't know that? They definitely think they're winning, big time. What our friend said at first didn't suicide bombing actually start the whole thing off on September 10th with the killing of the head of the Northern Alliance, Massoud. And now as Ahmed Rashid writes, and I do recommend him to you, and his very pessimistic analysis of how ISI is continuously helping Al-Qaeda and Taliban. He said, don't they think they're winning? And my response is, they absolutely think they're winning. To go back to the Massoud event, yes, those were outside suicide bombers. They weren't Afghans. I was referring to Afghans being suicide bombers, which is not something that's in their tradition, but which is something that's happening now. They learned that. Yeah, they think they're winning, and we have to make sure that they don't win. Just because they think they're winning doesn't mean they'll win. It means they think they're winning. They can be pushed, and we can control the landscape whenever we want to. What we have to do is we have to make it apparent to the Afghan people that there's more of a future on the other side. The title for tonight was Tribes and Tribulations. The Pashtun people are one of the largest tribal groups left on earth. They're a separate ethnicity, and as a people, leaving aside the Islamic part of it, they're threatened by the outside world, which is impinging on them from all sides, and they see that their way of life is disappearing, and they're very, very nervous about it, and they're trying to figure out ways to protect it, and this is one way. The Pashtun code, the Pashtun Valley, their way of life, is something that antedates Islam. They've been around, they are the original Aryans. They've been around for a very long time. Islam is something that was later added on and grafted and made part of that life, but it is not the core of it. So there are little places where you can move them apart. One of the things that, as I pointed out, they've been killing people in Pakistan, the landlord class and the tribal leaders, and particularly in the tribal areas. They've been trying to eliminate the traditional leadership because those are the people who could make things change and make the Pashtuns act in another way. And I would also point out that not all Pashtuns are Islamic fundamentalists by any stretch of the imagination. The party that won the election in the Northwest Territory in Pakistan in the last election was a Pashtun party, and it was a social democratic party. And one of the questions that maybe we want to go back and ask ourselves is, how come when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, we let ISI talk us into giving our money to the fundamentalists instead of the Pashtun social democrats who were alive and breathing at the same time? This is something that's come back to haunt us. Yes, sir?
What are the prospects of the United States promoting a Central Asian alliance of the various republics that are adjacent to Afghanistan?
A man after my own heart. I suggested that. It hasn't really gone anywhere. If you remember, we had CENTO. There was NATO and CENTO and CETO in the past. And my feeling is, why does the United States always have to pay for everything and do everything? It's their neighborhood. They should be more involved. So I very much think that's something we should do. And that's why I was talking about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, because they're nervous about us, but partly they're nervous about us because they don't know what we want to do. And I don't think that Washington knows what we want to do. We had someone from the State Department here a couple of months ago, and I asked him, what is our policy? And he said, well, if you don't know, no one knows. And I said, oh, God, here we are. So I think we need to figure out what our cards are and lay them on the table, and then say to these people, look, we don't want to take over this area. We want to work with you. Here's a big problem. Let's all solve this. And so I think we can do that. It's a new century. There are going to be new ways of thinking in new areas. And so I hope we can do something there. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
The president has directed Karzai that now that he's got another 5 years as leader of the country, to clean up his act and clean up the act in the next 6 months in regard to drug trade, etc. What is the chance of that happening in Europe?
Oh, sure. He said all the right things. Didn't you see him on the news today? President Karzai has already said we're going to crack down on corruption. We'll see. I saw the clips for both Karzai and Obama. And I could see that both sides were concerned about their conversation. President Obama said, we're going to see what you do, not just what you say. So we've heard what Karzai said. He said the right things. Let's see what he does. He's very elusive. Yeah.
October of 2009 was the worst month in the number of American deaths that have occurred since we got involved in Afghanistan. What's your prediction of the president's interaction and decision-making process, and what do you think he will come up to say at the end of this month?
Well, that's tea leaf reading, and it's unfair to do to President Obama. He's going to make the decision. I'm happy that he's thinking about it. I'm happy that he didn't rush into a decision. He really is concerned, and I think that's the proper thing to do. You have to think every day, again, about what it is we're doing and why we're doing it, because we are talking about lives, not just of Americans, but of people from all around the world. I think he's probably going to come in with a troop increase. I don't know if it will be the size. I mean, I have no inside information at all. Maybe I'm just saying what I would do, which is to do that, but make sure that we do the other things that I don't think we've been doing, so that we can get to an endgame situation. So I can't give you a figure on what he's going to do there. Of course, he has to deal with domestic pressure. As I said, the polls are now showing that more than half of the people in the country don't want us to be there anymore. That's probably only going to increase. This is the longest war we've been in. Why should we want to be there? I don't want to be there. I wish I could say, gee, we're really sorry we screwed up your country, but bye. But I'm afraid this problem is going to follow us, and that's why I said we have to make it a better thing before we can leave. Yes, sir.
It's a common theme in the liberal press in the United States. There are a great many similarities in approach to the problem of Afghanistan, former approach to Vietnam. What's your reaction to that proposition?
In Vietnam, right, you said? Yeah. The difference that I see is that in Vietnam, we did not have an enemy that was targeting the United States. We were dealing with a global threat in the sense of global communism, but we were not dealing with it. We inherited their problem from the French. Whereas in Afghanistan, we're there because of an attack that took place in the United States. Now, as you know, a lot of Europeans say, we're sorry all those people died, but we've lived with terrorism. Certainly the British have in Northern Ireland, and I don't have to give you all the examples. So they regard us as perhaps being too emotionally involved in the problem. One of the reasons they probably assigned me to Afghanistan was that for several years before, I've been warning Washington about Islamic fundamentalism and about these things, because September 11th was not the first attack, even on the World Trade Center. There were the embassy bombings in Cairo. There was the USS Cole. I mean, there were other things, and we just, pretended we didn't see until they finally really slapped us across the face. It is a problem that's not going to go away. I really do think that if we were to leave Afghanistan in the situation that it's now in, that there would be a fundamentalist state there that would be used as a platform to try to take over Pakistan, which is extremely frail. I don't think will, and which has a nuclear arsenal, and that's why I'm concerned. And I think over time that this will dissipate. If you remember, in the 1970s, Al-Fatah was a terrorist organization hijacking airplanes, and the whole world was terrified. And now there are preferred interlocutors. So people do change, things do change. This will change too. But we have to keep pushing in the right direction to make sure it doesn't change the way we don't want it to change. Yes, ma'am.
One more.
Okay.
With the focus on Central Asia, I was just wondering internally in the United States how the funding is going to State Department for positions in this area, to universities for language and area studies. Has there been an increase?
The short answer is yes. I don't have details. I'm not in the State Department. I retired in 2005, but I'm still in touch. My wife is still in the government. They did increase funding. for language. They increased the number of positions in the State Department, which is woefully understaffed. Is it sufficient? I can guarantee it's not sufficient. Our lack of knowledge about things in the United States government, foreign languages and area studies is terrible. And one of the problems with my little backhanded slap at security is that by locking our people up overseas, they don't get to know those things. I was successful in the Foreign Service because I'm a good linguist, and everywhere I went, I went out and I wandered around and I sat in the market and I got tummy problems and learned the languages and cultures of the countries I was in. And I'm afraid that our young diplomats abroad are not allowed to do that anymore. They're keeping them locked up in the embassy so nothing happens. And then when we need the knowledge, we don't have it. When I was ambassador in Tajikistan, they made me live in Kazakhstan because they thought bin Laden wanted to kill me. I'm sure he didn't know who I was. But anyhow, in that embassy there, they didn't have any American on the staff who spoke Kazakh. They had a number of people who spoke Russian. Well, that's great. If you go to Kazakhstan, you speak Russian and you're a foreigner, it means you're a Russian. Okay? If you go there and you speak really terrible Kazakh and you're a foreigner, you're certainly not a Russian. You know, whatever, you may be crazy, but you're not a Russian. You're different. And it's my point that that's what we should be doing. We should be approaching people on their level and let them know that things have changed, that we're different. But we haven't been doing that. That's another issue. Anyhow, thank you all.
I survived. Thank you.